That's first. Second, if you don't speak, I will appreciate everyone as to mute yourself. If you have a question about presentation, there will be a question time around the end of the webinar. You can put your questions in the chat box, or you will be able to raise your hand with the raise hand button at the bottom of the page. When you speak, please turn on your camera. Otherwise, in order to save broadband, it's better probably to turn it off. And that's basically it. I will ask now Professor Attila Jámbor to actually introduce the project and start the webinar. Attila, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zoltan, and hello everyone. My name is Attila Jámbor. I'm the coordinator of the Trade for SD project, and it's a real honor and pleasure that you have accepted our invitation to join this webinar today. I will share my screen and will show you some basic slides about the project. Hope you see my screen now. Okay, so our abbreviation is Trade for SD, and you may imagine that this is coming from the fact that we are analyzing trade and sustainable development interlinkages and challenges. This is the outline of my short presentation. And then some implementation details. And I will just show you today's agenda. So what is this project all about? Actually, we are analyzing the relationships between trade and sustainability. The premise of our project is that trade has the power to produce positive outcomes when policies are designed in a sustainable way. So a very important part of our project is to analyze European sustainable development related policies and analyze whether there's a coherence between these policies. And we would also like to propose some best practices and policy recommendations how to improve our current policies in this regard. And in order to reach our overall aims, we have several different sub-objectives which are organized through different VPs. I wouldn't go very much into the details here because that would take a lot of time, but just to show you how diverse and how multidisciplinary this project is, you see 7 VPs and objectives in this slide. And just to show you some of them, one of the packages are identifying the relevant indicators and also the linkages, direct and indirect, between SDGs and trade. Some of our packages are analyzing trade policies with reviews. Another big work package is our modeling package, where we would like to somehow model the different relationships between trade and sustainability. We also have a so-called qualitative work package, where we have different case studies, labbing, field experiments, and also a trade game exercise, where we would like to better understand how different stakeholders are behaving through the predefined value chains. We are also analyzing the coherence of EU policies and would like to also give some new options to improve the sustainability impacts of EU trade policies. And we, as usual in Horizon projects, we have a work package dedicated to communication and dissemination. We are using quite active stakeholder involvement through our 4-year-old project. In different work packages, you see in this table how we would like to interact with stakeholders. We are organizing various workshops, webinars like this, also interviews with important stakeholders. We are using Delphi method to create surveys. And also, as I mentioned before, we have different case studies and labbing the field experiments to involve the different views of the stakeholders throughout the whole project. We have 3 different impacts which are we would like to achieve in this whole project period. These first 3 are actually coming from the call which we were making the proposal for, and we have 2 extra which we hope that we can have this kind of impact as well. So the major impact would be better more evidence-based policies coming out from this exercise, but we would also like to somehow create an integrated framework on how to analyze EU trade-related policies together with the SDGs, and we would also like to somehow better understand the role of trade in the post-COVID era, and also regarding the impacts of the current Russian and Ukraine war. We have various different communication channels, and I think we are quite in using these channels. I hope you will have a chance to follow some of these if you are interested. These are just a few numbers, how we are structured. So this is a 4 years project. More than 60 colleagues are working together from 10 different, quite large number of deliverables, tasks, and milestones to achieve. This is the map of the consortium. We have most of the participants are coming from, but we also have 2 participating members. One outside Europe. One is from one team is from. As you can see from this list, we also have NGOs and FAO as an international organization who help us to better understand linkages, and many of our partners are quite distinguished members who are very active agriculture. So the aim of today's workshop is to discuss how EU trade policies and SDGs are related, with combining the views of different stakeholders, external advisory board members, academic representatives, and NGOs. And this way, we would like to somehow contribute to the process. I'm really happy that you could join us for today for this webinar, and I hope that there will be a nice and fruitful discussion related to this topic. 3 distinguished presenters and guests today. So I would give the floor to them now, and then would come a discussion section, and I hope that you will have a chance to ask questions. So thanks for this. That's all I wanted to say briefly about our project, and now I would give the floor to the.
Yeah, your sound fade away at the last minute, to me at least. I hope it was only at my end a problem. Thank you very much, Attila, for the short introduction. Next speaker is Patrizia Heidegger. I already made you a presenter, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation to this webinar. I'm Patrizia Heidegger from the European Environmental Bureau. We're the largest federation of environmental organizations in Europe. And we're also a founding member and active member of SDG Watch Europe, which is the largest civil society network in Europe working on the implementation of the SDGs in and by the European Union. And as part of SDG Watch Europe, already quite some years ago, I think in 2018 or 19, we've done a spotlight report on SDG implementation, trade and negative externalities called Who is Paying the Bill? Because we felt really early on in the EU's implementation of the SDGs that the relationship between sustainable development and trade and SDGs and trade wasn't really done properly. and that it was one of the very weak areas of SDG implementation across our region. And so, yeah, I'm really glad to be joining this webinar, and the work of the project seems to be closing a very important gap. So what I will be talking about for a few minutes is, well, if we look at how the EU is measuring its progress towards the SDGs, what is the problem in kind of measuring whether that whether we are achieving sustainable trade patterns or not? So, as you all know, the EU is doing its annual SDG monitoring report, the Eurostat report based on 100 SDG indicators. It's usually published in spring every year, and then we always get this kind of big picture summary of where we are with our progress towards the SDGs in the EU. And then what we usually see is that there's a few SDGs where we're seeing significant progress, or you could say sufficient progress. And then there's a majority of SDGs where we're seeing moderate progress, but moderate progress sounds very positive, but it actually means that we're not going to achieve the SDGs by 2030, with the ones that are in that field, which is the majority. And then there's always some SDGs where we're actually moving away from our goals. And for instance, for the last report, that was on clean water and also on life on land, so the whole biodiversity problem. Now, as we have said, I mean, this kind of analysis is based on the 100 SDG indicators, the Eurostat indicators. What is problematic with these indicators is that they do not cover or hardly cover the external dimension of European kind of practices, including trade. So basically, what that analysis does not really reflect are the positive and negative impacts that we have through our trade patterns on the rest of the world. So what we did in 2020, basically 5 years after the adoption of the 2030 agenda, we try to do as kind of united European civil society a monitoring, kind of a shadow SDG monitoring report for the EU, where we really went SDG by SDG, but where we also spent quite a bit of analysis on SDG indicators, and you know, which ones are strong and meaningful, and which ones are probably less meaningful, and which are the missing indicators. Well, one thing that we summarized about meaningful indicators is that what we're sometimes missing with, well, not all, but with some of the SDG indicators used by Eurostat, is that we first need to make sure that we focus with our indicators on the issues where we face the biggest sustainability challenges. So we can pick indicators where we're already doing rather well, or where there's easy wins, but that kind of misses the big picture. So for instance, if we look at things like how fuel efficient our cars are, then you know the indicator will say it's getting better, they're getting more fuel efficient. But then if we look at the number of cars and the amount of emissions, they're going up, so it's actually negative. So we have these kind of easy win indicators. Then we have certain problems that affect a lot of people inside and beyond the EU, but where we simply don't have any indicators. So I'll get to the ones related to trade, but inside the EU, one example would be homelessness. Homelessness is a massive social problem in the EU. It's probably one of the most extreme forms of poverty in a rich region, but we don't have an indicator on this, so we're not measuring that form of extreme poverty. And then, as I've already said, the current indicator set is not very strong at measuring the negative impact that we have through our trade patterns on the global commons. And we're not really able to monitor the negative spillover effects that our policies and practices have in third countries. And then, well, we also have some indicators which kind of create a bit of an illusion of sustainability. So for instance, one easy example would be we have one indicator, I think, linked to SDG 15 about the forest cover in the EU, and that indicator is evaluated positively. It's kind of pointing upwards. But then if you kind of look at the quality of the forests and whether they're biodiverse, whether they are actually contributing to healthy biodiversity in nature, that qualitative aspect is missing. So it's creating a bit of an illusion of sustainability. And then, of course, we still have a lot of indicators where we don't have any targets, which means any positive development will be seen as moving towards the SDGs, even where progress is slow, that we probably wouldn't even meet the SDG by 2100. So we spend a lot of time trying to think about what do we need to do to get the indicators right. And as I've said, one of those, one of the key findings was that we need indicators to measure our negative external impact. So, oops, I'm sorry. On trade, so as I've mentioned before, there are very few indicators that say something on kind of sustainability and trade from a European perspective in the EU Eurostat SDG indicator set. Other indicator sets, for instance, SDSN, as you probably know, have developed the spillover index score to exactly measure that, to measure international environmental and socioeconomic impacts that are embodied in trade, in the EU's trade, in each country's trade patterns. And if you look at that spillover index score, of course, we will see that many countries have a very unfavorable score because of the embedded negative externalities. So you could say that the current official Eurostat SDG indicator set hides the negative impacts that we have in our trade patterns, and it doesn't really allow us to measure how sustainable or unsustainable our trade patterns are. So the project that you have presented is really closing a very important gap in the current indicator system. So in the current Eurostat SDG indicator set, there's one specific indicator which is trade related, and it's the indicator on EU imports from developing countries. So the indicator basically looks at the value in kind of monetary terms, in prices, of imports to the EU from developing countries. So what does that indicator measure? It basically measures or says that the more we import from poor countries, developing countries, the better global partners we are in the EU, regardless of embedded labor exploitation, biodiversity threats, deforestation, pollution, or raw material depletion linked to that trade volume. So the imports to the EU that have a very high level of cost externalization, for instance, for pollution or labor exploitation, I mean, very obviously, they make our practices less sustainable and undermine sustainable development in third countries, but the indicator basically measures the opposite. The more we do of that, the better we score. So this is one example of an indicator which is very misleading in the Eurostat indicator set, and we've asked to remove that indicator. So to finish my presentation, we and others, for instance, SDSN, have already made kind of suggestions to Eurostat ever since Eurostat started measuring the SDGs on what possible indicators could be added to measure whether our trade patterns are sustainable or not. And I'm sure you're familiar with many of these ideas. I mean, one, of course, is to look at CO2 emissions embedded in imports. The SDSN monitoring report is already doing that. We could also measure deforestation embedded in imported materials and products. SDSN is already measuring the biodiversity threats in imported goods and materials. We could look at the volume of materials and products imported that are linked to exploitative working conditions. SDSN is already looking at an indicator measuring victims of modern slavery embodied in EU imports. We could look into raw materials dependence. We could look into export of waste. SDGs is looking into the export of plastics waste as one indicator. And finally, we could look into the export of goods banned in the EU, but that we sell on other markets with negative impacts on environment and health. So for instance, SDGs is looking into the export of banned pesticides. So to sum it up, I think from the side of civil society, but also of course from research, there are a lot of very good ideas of how we can better measure in the official SDG monitoring report for the EU and the member states how well we're doing with sustainable or not so sustainable trade. Unfortunately, so far that's not really reflected in the official SDG monitoring practices. It's a shame because this year, as you probably know, the EU for the first time will present its European voluntary review at the UN level, at the high-level political forum in July, and that would have been a fantastic opportunity to actually integrate such indicators on the more global dimension of our economic patterns and our trade patterns. That's been a missed opportunity, but we hope that that will be rectified soon, and I hope that your research findings will contribute to coming up with a more meaningful indicator set for the EU. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Especially thank you for referring back to what you expect from our project, which is an important input for us to implement the project better in the future. Now, I made our next speaker, Giovanni Ferri from LUMSA University, as a presenter, so you should be able to share your screen. And thank again for Patrizia for the intro, for this intervention, especially mentioning forest, which is very close to my heart. So, Mr. Ferri, the floor is yours, and you should be able to share screen. If there is any trouble, let me know. I can share your presentation through my screen.
Why don't you share your screen if you don't mind?
Yeah, okay.
I'm having some trouble finding the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I will be doing in just a few minutes that I have at my disposal is to congratulate the project leaders and the entire project participants in the sense that I think this is a very important project examining how trade relates to the sustainable development and what are the multiple linkages between the two levels is very important. And what I will be doing is talking specifically about two issues. The first one is to tell you something about the master in which
sorry, just a second. I'm sorry, I have a trouble, so I would like to ask a bit of help from Anastasia as a co-host. Anastasia, can you potentially share Mr. Ferri's presentation, because my computer doesn't follow my instructions. I just sent the presentation to you, yeah? Just, I'm sorry for this inconvenience.
Yeah, yes, we are dealing with it. Just a moment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
So I will be dealing with. I will be telling you something about the master which I am directing, that was founded, was conceived in 2015, right at the time that the SDGs were agreed upon. And thank you very much. You can move on to the second slide. And this will be an example of how to operationalize the SDGs, and I will tell you about the Master in Management of Sustainable Development Goals, with which we have developed almost 100. We have graduated almost 100 people around the world who are endowed with the skills of being sustainable managers in any potential organizations they can work for, planning for the transformation of that organization towards the new environment in which the SDGs are becoming the main drivers of what we do. Then I will, the second point I will deal with is how to, showing how some indicators of how the green transition is already providing competitive advantages to the European Union. So, of course, there are costs of the transition, but there is also some competitive advantage that is being gained through that. So please, next slide. This is the concept of our master as it was conceived in 2015 and developed in 2017. We are launching the 6th edition of this master next week. It is a blended format with 3 residential weeks in Rome, because I teach at the university which is called LUMSA. It is a Catholic university in Rome, not far from we are in the center of Rome. And what we do, we develop a course, a one-year course in which we move along 5 pillars. The first one is about the Sustainable Development Goals. The second one is about sustainable social economy. Then we have pillar 3, which is the biggest one, on sustainability management. Pillar 4 on environmental management, and pillar 5 on sustainable finance. We have that our students who come from all over the world, as I'll show you in a minute, are subdivided into teams, and each team is given different tasks. There is a teamwork together with individual work. There is also an internship with some international institutions or some private companies. And at the end, they have to write a thesis. If we move on to the next slide, I will be able to show, next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'll be able to show you how the project really became international in just the first 3 years. Other additional countries have added up in more recent years, but these were the 32 countries lighted in green, colored in green, in green, were already represented in the first 3 years. Now we are in 50 countries. I mean, in almost 90 sustainable managers coming from 50 countries. Let's move to the next slide. I just have a few minutes left to show you how the green transition is already shaping up a competitive advantage for the European Union. And I will focus on just a few indices. The first one I recover from the statistics regarding renewable energy sources. The percentage of electric energy in the European Union, which was coming from renewable sources in 2020 was 37.5%, as it was published by Eurostat. And that is almost twice as much as, compared to the 20.3% that was published for the US. If we move to the next slide, please. Now, the extent of circular economy is very interesting case in which, according to Eurostat, in 2020, 30% of the production in the European Union was coming, involved the circular economy. And this is interesting because it is not possible to make a comparison, because in the United States it is not even reported, this data, which means that there is no attention to it, because as you know, what we care, we measure about, what we don't care, we don't measure. So if we take a proxy, which is really bad and partial proxy of the circular economy, which is the opposite, I mean, the plastic waste per year in kilograms, we find for 2020 that it was 105 kilos in the US, 81 kilos in Germany, 56 kilos in Italy. Next slide, please. The third The third competitive advantage is not strictly speaking in innovation, because if we look at the top 10 countries in terms of the top countries in numbers of patent applications filed in 2020, we see that China is enormously leading, and then the United States are following. Japan is coming third, Korea is coming fourth, and Europe is a fifth, well distanced from the others. But if you move into the patents that are more strictly related to the green innovation, then the thing is different. The rank is different. And if you look at plastic recycling technologies and technologies related to bioplastics, then the rank for Europe is first, together with the US, or even a little slightly better. Next slide, please. Finally, next slide, please. Next slides, please.
We had some troubles with our...
Okay, thank you very much. The next one is the access to green finance. This is the final point I want to raise as an indicator of competitive advantage for the European Union. As we all know, in Europe, there is an advantage in terms of ESG. The ESG ratings, environmental, social, governance ratings, are becoming the compass, have already become the compass for sustainable financial investment. And what we see is that they are 23% higher in the European Union compared to the US. Much of that depends on the proactive approach that the European Union has taken towards non-financial reporting, because we had a directive on non-financial reporting in 2014, and another one, the CSRD, which is in the process of being finalized. So this is where some stimuli I wish to provide to our webinar, which are partly related to trade and sustainable development, partly they are not. But at least in terms of international trade, we provided international trade related to sustainable developments in terms of SDGs, the knowledge of SDGs, which we have disseminated throughout the world from Europe. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for this quick but still very detailed presentation, especially on, I was really pleased to hear about your MSc course, which I guess was a new thing for maybe some of the participants here, and the finances. That was an interesting element which could be linked to the financial taxonomy regulations in Europe. So next speaker is Roberta de Santis. I already made you a presenter. I hope you will be able to share your screen.
Yes, thank you, Zoltan. Here I am. Let me, okay. I think you can see my presentation.
Yes, we can see your presentation, and we hear you as well.
Very well. So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate to this webinar. And secondly, since 5 out of 17 SDGs are related to environmental protection, I will concentrate my discussion today on the relationship between environmental regulation and trade. Okay, very well. Why it is important to assess the impact of environmental regulation on trade? Because environmental regulation is becoming increasingly stringent, and that is evident in many of the latest decision of the European Commission. So the very ambitious targets in terms of climate neutrality and reduction of greenhouse gases emissions, plus, as I said already, that 5 out of 17 of SDGs are related to environmental issues. And moreover, we have that a big part of the financial support coming from the Recovery and Resilience Facility is devoted to environmental issues. And very, very recently, a few days ago, the European Commission presented the Green Deal Industrial Plan, which is a plan to support the green transition of the European industry towards climate neutrality. So, since the environmental regulation is becoming more and more stringent, my discussion is on whether the environmental regulation might actually damage the trade. I said that environmental regulation is becoming more and more stringent, and then I intend to prove it using the well-known OECD environmental policy stringency indicator. This is an index, a composite index, measuring the stringency of the environmental policy. Okay, here in this chart, we have the black horizontal dotted line representing the average value of the indicator in the period 1990-2007, while the colored histograms represent the leveling indicators in the average in the period 2008-2015. So, as you can notice, with very few exceptions, the stringency of the environmental policy increased comparing the two subperiods. You see histograms of 3 different colors because the environmental policy stringency indicator can also be disentangled in subcomponents, displaying the behavior of market-based and non-market-based environmental provisions. So, for example, green taxes, market-based environmental provision, and emission targets, non-market-based environmental provisions. So, what we notice in this chart, however, it is that actually the environmental stringency is becoming more and more stringent. There is an increasing stringency of the environmental policy. If we look at the next chart, this is an update of the previous chart showing for sample of OECD countries the behavior of the environmental policy indicator in the years 2016 to 2020. And we notice again that there is that the trend of increasing stringency is confirmed. So, as I said, that is the composition of the indicator, but that I'm not going to discuss right now. So we have as a fact that the stringency of environmental protection is increasing, and therefore it is really important to assess whether the increasing stringency might or might not damage international trade. The theory on this issue is there are two main theories on this issue. The first is a conventional, more traditional theory stating that environmental protection comes as an additional cost for firms, thus damaging international competitiveness and international trade. That is the so-called trade-off hypothesis. On the opposite, the Porter hypothesis, which is a completely different theory, states that actually the environmental regulation might provide incentive to firms to innovate, and through technical innovation might improve productivity, international competitiveness, and international trade. So it is completely different from the trade-off hypothesis, because in the case suggested by Porter van der Linde in 1995, the environmental protection might actually determine a win-win solution in which not only it is possible to improve the protection of the environment, but also the business performance. So actually the transmission mechanism is quite simple. Now the environmental policy trigger provides incentive for innovation, research, development, and these will benefit both environment and business performance. There are three variants of this well-known paradigm. The first is the weak version, stating that despite environmental policy will provide incentive to innovate, the cost of innovation might offset the benefit in terms of productivity, international competitiveness, and trade. While the strong version of the Porter hypothesis suggests the opposite, that the benefit coming from the green innovation will be greater than the cost associated to innovate. Eventually, there is this other version of this quite appealing theory, stating a very interesting aspect of this story. So stating that it is important an appropriate design of the environmental policy in order to make to trigger the Porter mechanism. And according to the narrow version of the Porter hypothesis, the market-based, so the green taxes, for example, the market-based environmental policy instruments are the most suitable in order to provide incentive to firms to innovate. What about the economic literature? The empirical papers, especially the papers published very recently, they are in favor of the Porter hypothesis. So what I'm saying is that the empirical literature is somehow in favor of the idea that under certain circumstances for some groups of countries, the Porter hypothesis holds. So what about, even if the Porter hypothesis holds, still there are some challenges for the policymaker in order to exploit all the benefits coming from this kind of situation. For example, it is true, even if it is true that increasing the stringency of environmental policy, it will, through technical innovation, improve international competitiveness and trade, there is a transition period in which there might be some adverse redistributive effect. And to face this situation, it is important for firms, sectors, and countries to have financial resources. But actually, this was clear to the European Commission. In fact, some solutions to some financial support has been already provided by the Just Transition Mechanism in Europe, and the large amount of the financial resources coming to recovery plan in order to achieve the green transition. The second important aspect, the second important policy challenge, according to me, is related to the design of the environmental policy. First of all, which is mostly related to this very important project, so Trade for Sustainable Development. It is, and as Professor Jámbor said previously, it is very important to complement environmental policy and trade policies in a very effective way in order to create a favorable environment for innovation and reach the win-win solution suggested by Porter. And the second aspect is that even if it is true that the environmental policy might create incentive for firms to innovate, it is also important that the environmental policy provide permanent incentives to innovate, and not a one-shot incentive. And to do this, once again, it is important that the environmental policy are designed in a suitable ways. For example, it might be appropriate to use more dynamic types of environmental policy. Once again, the literature is slightly in favor of market-based environmental policy rather than non-market-based. And once again, in the very recently presented Green Deal Industrial Plan, the first pillar is exactly about that. So it is the first pillar of the Green Deal Industrial Plan is about creating a predictable and simplified regulatory environment in order to create a favorable environment to complement environmental and trade policies and reach a win-win solution as the one described by the Porter hypothesis. So to conclude, I will recap what I said. So I said that it is very important to assess what is the impact of environmental protection on international trade, because environmental protection is becoming more and more stringent. That there is, let's say, a view, a paradigm suggesting that there might be a win-win solution between environmental protection and international trade through technical innovation. Despite the fact that there might be these win-win solutions, still policy challenges remain, such as the necessity to create a consistency between environmental and trade policies, and the necessity to create environmental policies that might provide a permanent incentive to firms to innovate. And it seems, however, that, and I'm concluding, that the European Commission has these aspects very clear in mind, also releasing this very important Green Deal Industrial Plan with a specific focus on how the regulatory environment has to be designed. Thank you. Here there are the papers, if you are interested, discussing and testing empirically the Porter hypothesis.
Thank you very much. Especially thanks for providing additional references at the end of the presentation. So we have, I have to say thank you to all of the speakers, because you kept timing in order to allow a few minutes for questions. So as I wrote in the chat box, you either raise your hand or you write a question in the chat box saying the name of the speakers that you would like to specifically address. I haven't seen yet a hand, I think. At least no one appears on my computer. So if that allows me to ask a question actually in relation to the last presentation, Mr. Santis, the consistency in the regulatory approach and the regulations. Could you clarify a little bit whether is there any impact of how the EU decision making, because currently there is a very rapid and very vivid policy environment in the EU in relation to climate change and environment, biodiversity. How do you think this impact the innovation? How this impact companies in terms of trade and innovation?
I can answer not as a policymaker, but as an economist, actually. But from the empirical point of view, what we tested in our papers was that the European Commission is slightly using a more market-based environmental policy. And according to our test, it might be better in order to achieve this win-win solution described by Porter. And again, in another paper that I wrote, I tested whether the participation to international environmental agreements such as Kyoto, Montreal could have some impact on international trade, but that was a paper in 2012, so it is not updated. And I found out that the participation in these kind of agreements might actually reduce the negative impact of environmental protection on international trade. So it is an issue requiring a lot of discussion. But I believe that the European Commission has very clear in mind, that at least the OECD has very clear in mind this Porter framework, but still, I don't have an answer in terms of policies. It seems to me that this, the fact that the industrial, the Green Deal industrial plan, very recently released, and put a focus on environmental regulation, because this is the first pillar. So. Maybe it's not a market or non-market-based environmental policy, but for sure the idea is that it has to be well-integrated environmental regulation environment, also with the other trade policies and industrial policies.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, we got one question from Alan Matthews in the chat box. Environment trade regulations being introduced by EU can help to limit negative external effects of trade as identified by Patrizia, but also risk the fragmentation of trade. Does the panel have any ideas how to minimize this trade-off? So I don't know who would like to say, Giovanni or Patrizia, Mr. Santis, any who would like to respond on this question?
I can have a view on this if you ask me. I think that the idea that imposing regulations has always a backfire, and I'd like to tell you the story that I know better about non-financial reporting. In the European Union, as you know, and I already said in my first intervention, the non-financial reporting has become mandatory. And that is a very important step, in the sense that by introducing non-financial reporting, you are making it compulsory for companies of certain sizes, at least. You are providing them with the right incentive to evaluate their performance, not only in making profits, but also looking at the triple bottom line, looking at the environmental creation of value and the impact on society. But at the same time, by the time you are making the non-financial reporting mandatory, that signal becomes less important for the markets. And we have done studies in which we show that having companies, listed companies, doing non-financial reporting in Europe has less meaning it is less meaningful for financial markets in terms of reactions to shocks, environmental shocks and things like that. So I suspect the same thing it can be translated to this new environment, to the issue of restrictions and laws in regarding trade. And by the time you introduce some regulations, you are modifying the opportunities, and these may have also backfire effects.
Thank you. And I have one, actually I still have one question to Patrizia. I hope you can turn on your camera, because you mentioned forest as one in the indicator, like I guess my interpretation of your reference to forest as an indicator was linked to quality versus quantity. But recently the EU, the MEPs of the European Parliament agreed on the EU deforestation law with the Council. How do you think that could impact, how satisfied with the NGO sector is with this deforestation law, which clearly have some impact on those products like cocoa, rubber, wood, the trade of these products. Could you comment on that maybe? Fortunately, yeah, I don't see Patrizia any longer, or I saw her, but she's muted. So until we get this, an additional question to Giovanni Ferri, the program of a Master in Management of Sustainable Development goals is very important and interesting. How do you think about the roles of leaders in achieving SDGs in developing countries, whether that master program focus on scientists or practitioners, how that program can work in developing countries?
Oh, thank you very much for raising this issue, Sultan. We have seen that the move towards sustainable development is causing some problems. Some of these problems are distributional across rich countries versus less developed countries. And it was very clear at the COP27 in Egypt last year how the issue is becoming more and more acute, where we need to think as rich countries as taking some form of responsibility for having caused the problem of CO2 and other greenhouse gases emissions for 200 years that we were developing and other countries were not. And so we have to be able to involve and to always move along the dialogue between more developed and less developed countries and emerging countries. And the dialogue is much easier if you share the common knowledge, a common background in terms of and so by having built a network of almost 100 sustainable managers around the world, we think we gave a contribution to this dialogue. Now, of course, the negotiations will have to be done by the leaders of the countries, by the governments, by the international organizations. But certainly, if we want to avoid, there is a potential source of conflict here. And if we want to avoid conflict, which is natural, according to SDG 16, which is about peace and justice, if we want to avoid conflict, knowledge and sharing of approaches towards the sustainable transition is very important.
Thank you. And now we are almost at the end of the hour, so I would like to give the floor to Gaia Angelini from Lumina, my colleague, who will conclude the webinar. Gaia.
Thank you, Zoltan. So thank you very much. I will take just a couple of minutes to recap about the most important messages I have learned today and I took note of from the speakers. The fact that the EB has done a very comprehensive analysis of the 2030 indicators produced by Eurostat, and they have noticed that some of them are very useful, but there is some discrepancies and some missing information and even some misleading conclusion out of the picture coming from the Eurostat, and that in relation to trade and sustainability, we definitely need more indicator, more precise, and especially focusing on the external dimension. From Professor Giovanni Ferri, we have learned today that green transition in the European Union is advancing and is actually at international level being led by the European Union, but that there are some shortcomings in terms of investments in innovation. For example, it was very interesting to see that we have a very high level number of patenting, but at the very end, in terms of innovation, the US has more patent than the European Union, despite the investments. And therefore, this could be undermine also our trade capacity all over the world. And from Roberta De Santis, professor at the University of Louis, we have learned that as we all know, of course, the European environmental legislation is increasingly stringent, and that coupled with the market-based instrument, this could lead to some economic development and better access to external markets, but also respect of the external dimension in terms of the SDGs. That this is something that is in progress, but probably as we are experiencing, not enough. And it's good to know that also economists are considering environment as an asset and not as a damage to the economy. And so I would like to conclude, and thank you very much to all of you to be here, and I hope you will follow us. The project is running. We are organizing on a regular basis webinar, and please follow our social media, our website. The webinar of today will be uploaded, both the presentation and the recording. And thank you very much, and I hope to see you next time.
Yeah, thanks, Gaia, for the sum up and wrap up. Thanks for the speakers and all the participants. Don't forget that we have a newsletter. You can sign up. We will have a podcast available on the website soon. And as Gaia pointed out, follow us on the various social media channels on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, and get to our website where we have a blog regularly coming up from the researchers reporting back on results or preliminary results on the trade for SD.EU under this domain. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye, thank you.